The stars began to go out at 3:17 in the morning, Greenwich time. Arseny Demidov, flight engineer of the 69th expedition, hung by the porthole of the service module, waiting for sunrise. This was his own time, claimed by no regulation. 12 minutes between finishing maintenance on the regeneration system and the communication session with Earth. 12 minutes when you could simply look. Vega went out first. Arseny blinked and decided he'd imagined it. In orbit, you couldn't trust your eyes. They lied more often than the pressure gauges. Then 2 stars beside it vanished. Then 3 more. Across the sky, diagonally through the constellation Lyra, crawled a hole. Not a cloud, not a glare, not a reflection of the cabin lights on the glass, an actual hole. Neat, with even edges, black with a blackness deeper than space itself. The hole was moving, and judging by how fast it was eating the stars, it was either very small and close, or very large and very far away. Arseny estimated the angular velocity and felt sweat break out under his suit liner at the back of his neck. Small, close objects didn't fly on trajectories like that.
Zarya, this is Astra. I'm observing an occultation of the star field. The area is about 5 degrees, moving relative to the background. No object visible optically. None at all.
The pause on the line ran longer than protocol allowed.
Astra, clarify. What do you mean, none at all?
Exactly that. I see the shadow. Whatever's casting it, I don't.
In Houston, it was the dead of night, and the duty shift at the Space Operations Center was drinking bad coffee from a machine no one had serviced since last fiscal year. The report from the Russian segment of the ISS reached them 15 minutes later, along with a polite request to point something more serious than a human eye at that patch of sky. The duty officer of the Space Force, a lieutenant named Barrows, aimed a long-range detection radar at the indicated sector and saw nothing. Tried LIDAR, nothing. Requested infrared imaging from the early warning satellite. And that was when he started to feel sick, because the early warning satellite didn't answer. It didn't answer the way an unplugged iron doesn't answer. No malfunction, no interference, no emergency telemetry. The satellite had simply ceased to exist as a radio-technical fact. Over the next 40 minutes, 11 more spacecraft ceased to exist. American, European, Chinese, 1 Russian. Later, when ground telescopes photographed the debris, it turned out every satellite had been cut. Not exploded, not burned, cut cleanly and economically, in a single motion, like bread. Something had swept through the orbits with a giant invisible knife, and there was more menace in that neatness than in any explosion. This was how you cleared a space. This was how, stepping into a stranger's dark house, you first moved the barrel of the homeowner's shotgun away from yourself. At 4:51 Greenwich time, the object stopped hiding. In the 19th hour, a spark detached from the ship. The lander entered the atmosphere over Canada, unhurried, as if out for a stroll, crossed the airspace of the United States. 4 flights of interceptors flew alongside it like an honor guard, and the pilots reported that the object simply did not see them, and landed in Oklahoma, in the wheat field of a farmer named Jedediah Crow, 60 miles from the nearest town. Jed Crow, 64 years old, a widower, saw it first. Before the helicopters, before the federal agents, before anyone. He came out onto the porch in his underclothes, shotgun in hand, brought along more out of respect for the genre than anything else, and stood a long while looking at a matte egg the height of a grain silo, sitting in the middle of his winter wheat. The egg was cooling, ticking softly, the way a stove ticks as it cools toward evening. Then a niche opened in the side of the egg, lit by a soft glow. And Jed, walking up to it, he could never later explain to the investigators why he walked up, only said, wouldn't have been polite not to. Saw a casket inside the niche. On the casket was written, in neat block letters, in English, Russian, Chinese, and a dozen other languages, to the government of Earth.
Well, we don't have one of those, mister. Never quite got around to it.
And he went to call the sheriff. The document was opened at Andrews Air Force Base, in a bunker, in the presence of 11 heads of state, the G7, and the invited guests, Russia, China, India, Brazil. The gathering had been assembled in 19 hours, protocol, visas, and decades-old grudges be damned. Fear proved a better diplomat than every foreign ministry on Earth combined. Inside the casket lay a single sheet, not paper, something dense, warm to the touch, pleasant, like well-tanned leather. Experts would later determine that the message's material slowly consumed itself and would vanish without a trace in exactly 3 days. The aliens, it turned out, knew how to work with deadlines. The text was short. Demand to the government of Earth. In the time it takes your planet to complete 3 full rotations, select 47 Earthlings and hand them over to us. Then you will have a chance. We await 47 people at the site where the capsule bearing this message has landed. That was all. No signature, no explanation, no threats. Threats, as it happened, weren't necessary. 12 severed satellites spoke louder than any postscript. The President of the United States, a former military lawyer, a man who had prided himself his whole life on never having made a decision he later regretted, looked around at those seated at the table and thought that in 3 days that pride would end. Whatever else happened.
Colleagues, for nearly the whole of its existence, humanity has asked itself whether we are alone in the universe. We got lucky. We received an answer. Or rather, the answer found us. But now we stand before a civilization whose power we can judge only by its calling card, and that calling card is 12 of our satellites, opened up like tin cans. We don't know what weapons they have. We know only that they didn't even bother defending against ours. They didn't need to. Before we begin arguing, I ask everyone to keep that asymmetry in mind.
Asymmetry. A pretty word. Mr. President, are you certain of the translation? Are you certain these 47 are a sacrifice? That we're sending them to slaughter? Perhaps like savages, we're about to offer a virgin to the gods, when the gods simply asked us to send a delegate to a conference.
The treachery of their arrival leaves us no room for doubt. They walked into our house without knocking and, first thing, knocked out our teeth. After that, I consider debating the finer shades of their vocabulary a luxury.
The capsule landed in the United States. Perhaps that's an address. Perhaps it's Americans they want specifically. I'm not saying this out of malice, Mr. President. I'm saying it because in 70 hours, someone in this room will have to look 47 of their own citizens in the eye, and I'd like to know in advance whose eyes those will be.
The capsule landed in Oklahoma because Oklahoma is flat and empty. Let's not read tea leaves.
I propose something else. Instead of guessing what they want, let's decide whom we can worthily send. Let's gather the chosen, or volunteers from different countries, the best among us. Scientists, doctors, those who know how to speak and how to listen. If these 47 are the face of Earth, let Earth have a worthy face.
The face of Earth. Mr. Chairman, and what if it isn't a face, but feed? Why send our best to certain death? Put yourself in their place. A highly advanced civilization arrives at an anthill and asks for 47 ants. What use does a highly advanced civilization have for ants? Conversation? They need material. Biological material for experiments. That's the most harmless of my guesses.
And what do you propose? Condemned criminals.
The room went quiet. You could hear the ventilation humming, and somewhere behind the wall, in the equipment room, a faint electronic chirp.
Yes, I've already thought about it. People whom our own laws, our courts, our juries, everything we call civilization, have already sentenced to death. We would be taking nothing from them that we hadn't already decided to take ourselves. I understand how that sounds. I hear how it sounds. But the decision must be a joint one, and I don't want to force it through by weight alone. I propose a democratic procedure. A secret vote opens. Condemned criminals, scientists, military, diplomats, volunteers.
Democratic. Secret. So that afterward no one will know which of us is the cannibal.
So that each of us answers to himself, not to the cameras. Those are different things, Mr. President.
They're the same thing. Just seen from different sides.
A young man on staff, an aide named David Lim, 29 years old, admitted to the bunker only because someone had to hand out the ballots, would later, years afterward, write in his memoirs.
They voted for 11 minutes. I stood by the table and watched the most powerful people on the planet walk up one by one to the black box, and every single one of them, without exception, wore the face of a man who badly wants this to turn out to be a dream. That was when I understood that power isn't the right to decide. It's the inability not to decide.
The count was held in front of everyone. Volunteers, 18%. Diplomats, 9. Scientists, 7. Military, 29. Condemned criminals, 37%.
The decision has been made. I asked the governments with the relevant population to submit candidates within 24 hours.
They dispersed in silence. Already at the door, the Indian delegate lingered and said quietly to the host of the summit alone,
"You know what won't leave me alone, Mr. President? Not what we chose, how fast we chose it. We had 70 hours. We managed it in 11 minutes.
Manuel Reyes, known as Mano, learned about the end of the world last of everyone, because death row at the federal prison known as Altiplano had no television, no radio, and the guards didn't share news with condemned men out of principle, or maybe out of superstition. He was 52 years old. 21 of them he'd spent in a cell 3 meters by 4 for shooting 2 people dead on the night of the 9th of May, 2005. And he really had shot them. The court hadn't erred by a hair. For the first 5 years, he invented excuses for himself. For the next 5, he invented escapes. And then he stopped inventing either one and started reading. The prison chaplain brought him whatever books came to hand. And so it happened that over the remaining years, Mano Reyes read more than many a university course, from Cervantes to a high school astronomy textbook missing its cover and its last chapter. So when they led him out of his cell, loaded him onto a bus with barred windows and drove him north. And the man on the bench beside him, a jittery kid from Texas named Dwayne, whispered to him about a ship, about a message, about where they were being taken. Mano Reyes did not scream and did not cry. He looked out the window, where a high, freshly washed morning sky stood over the plain, and asked only,
47. Why 47? Not 50? Not 100?
What difference does it make?"
Dwayne's hands were shaking.
This much difference. It's an uneven number. Uneven numbers don't come out of nowhere, son. An uneven number is always somebody's precise calculation.
They were gathered from all over the country and from Mexico. 39 men and 8 women. Killers, every one of them out of appeals. Each was offered a deal, for form's sake, though none of them had a choice. Participation in a special federal program, in exchange for commutation of sentence. The wording was a masterpiece of bureaucratic poetry. The sentence really was being commuted, since someone else now intended to carry it out. The night before the deadline they spent in army tents, a mile from the capsule. They were fed well, indecently well. Steak, apple pie, coffee without limit. And that consideration was more frightening than any chains, because every one of them knew what a meal like that was called. Dwayne didn't sleep. He sat on his cot, arms around his knees, and talked about the lawyer who'd sold him out, about his mother who hadn't been told, about how maybe he'd deserved the needle but not this, whatever this turned out to be.
Shut up.
Let him talk. He's 26. At 26, a man's entitled to be scared out loud. Dwayne, you listening to me? Here's what you need to understand. You and me, we spent 20 years being a mistake. Waste. They kept us in concrete and waited for the day they could write us off. And now, for some reason, we're needed by an entire other civilization, if you can believe that. Not their presidents, not their generals, not their movie stars, but you and me. I don't know why. Maybe for organs, maybe for experiments. But I'll tell you this, being needed is not the worst news a man can get. The worst news, you and me, we already had.
What if it hurts?
Then we'll bear it. Nothing new about that.
At dawn, they were formed into a column and marched across the field. The wheat, what had survived, stood waist-high, wet with dew, and 47 people in orange jumpsuits walked through it, leaving dark trails behind them, while all around, at a respectful distance, stood soldiers, diplomats, doctors, and everyone was silent, and no one dared give an order, because there was no regulation for what was happening. Jed Crow, the farm had never been bought out from under him. There hadn't been time. Watched from behind the cordon and, they say, took off his hat. The capsule waited. For 3 days it hadn't made a sound, and now, as the column approached, high above it, at the zenith, the ship appeared soundlessly. It descended until it filled half the sky, and its 7 kilometers hung over the wheat field without a single sound, without wind, without a tremor in the earth, in flagrant disregard for every law humanity had ever discovered. Mano Reyes stood in the front row. He found the east with his eyes, where the sun was rising, an ordinary sun, red gold, wrapped in feathered clouds, and looked at it, not at the ship. He'd read in his textbook with no last chapter that his star had some 4 billion such dawns left, and decided that this one, 47 billionth in line for today, was his rightful share, and let them try to take it.
Don't shake. Stand straight. Right now, like it or not, we're all of humanity. They've got nobody else.
The light came from above, soft, warm, the color of melted milk. Witnesses disagree on the details, but agree on one thing. None of the 47 screamed. The beam held for 11 seconds, and when it faded, the field was empty. Only 47 dark paths through the wet wheat, all breaking off at once, like unfinished sentences. The ship left orbit within the hour. It left the way you'd leave without saying goodbye. And a silence fell that lasted 7 days and was worse than everything that had come before it. For 7 days, humanity lived with a stone in its throat, praying, ashamed, making excuses, writing editorials. A hard choice, the price of survival. And not one editorial answered the question David Lim, the aide, wrote in his diary at the time. We paid our way out. But out of what? On the 8th day, every radio telescope on Earth, every communication satellite, every receiver, down to kitchen radios and hearing aids, picked up a message at the same moment. It sounded in every language at once, and the voice was calm and attentive, like a good doctor's.
People of Earth, thank you for your cooperation. In the time that has passed, we have come to understand your languages and your culture considerably better. We apologize for the technical damage caused upon our arrival. It will be compensated.
We report. Your 47 people have been received, are in good health, and are en route to the center of the Federation. They will represent your planet before the Galactic Federation in its consideration of Earth's degree of maturity and its readiness for admission to the Federation.
The question of whom exactly a civilization hands over when asked for people, without being told why, is the first part of that consideration. Your choice has been recorded.
The hearing is now open.